And I would like to extend my respects to elders past and present, as well as to emerging leaders. And I suppose the reason why we're all here today is we've just done a little bit of research on youth workplace rights. And before I get on and speak about that research and some of the things that we found out, I just want to give a little bit of housekeeping. We do have Nellie Muller in the chat, so if you want to reach out, put any questions, comments, observations in the chat, please feel free to do so. We also have captions enabled. So if you'd like to activate your captions, please feel free to do so. And we will be recording today. So if you'd like to black out your screen, that's absolutely no bother whatsoever. So I suppose we should just make a little bit of a start. And I suppose the reasonable place to start is to sort of think about, well, why was it at AYAC that we wanted to do this topic, and why did we want to sort of focus on this topic now? And I think one of the real key things for us was we identified this real need to rebalance the debate and to ensure accountability. So often when we talk about young people and employment or young people in the workplace, we really sort of focus on their job readiness and their flexibility to meet the needs of employers. Much less do we focus on their status as right holders and their ability to claim those rights and the pathways that are open to them to claim those rights. So at the minute, when we think about young people in the workplace, we have this quite unbalanced conversation that isn't really looking too much at how do we empower young people as rights holders in the workplace to ensure that they are able to work free from exploitation. And another sort of thing when we were coming to this topic, a reason why we wanted to address it is the system itself is so complex. You know, Australia's workplace relations system, it involves overlapping federal and state responsibilities. There's loads of different awards, enterprises agreements, regionally varied employment ages, and differences around how young people are allowed to work when they're in school. So, young people actually, when they are moving into that transition to into work, are actually confronted with this incredibly complex system. So, it is imperative that we equip them to be able to navigate that system and make that system as simple for them to navigate as possible. And I think as well, when we were sort of thinking about these two things combined, so we have this unbalanced debate, but we also have this systems complexity. But another sort of component in this, which sort of I think really paints this full picture, is that we know that young people are often employed in casual, insecure, low-paid forms of work, and that this can limit their bargaining power, increase their dependence on employers, and it can actually make it more difficult to recognize and assert their workplace rights. So we really have a need here to ensure that young people actually know what their rights and entitlements are and that they're able to work through the different systems that we have to make sure that they can claim those rights in practice. So that's why we decided to really focus in on this topic at this present moment. Um, and so, where is our study situated? Our report? Well, we're really trying to build up on some existing evidence. And primarily, we're trying to build on some more recent evidence, which is the Fair Days Work Report by the Uni of Melbourne in 2025, and a couple of more sort of local Victorian reports done by West Justice. And where does our research really try and build on these reports? Well, a big sort of thing that we're trying to do with this report is provide additional consultation and statistical evidence on young people's subjective experiences concerning knowledge gaps and reporting difficulties. And this really is to try and build upon the insights from the 12 person co-design aspect of the Faraday's work report. So there are some sort of findings there around those sort of subjective experiences, but they primarily come from quite a sort of small sample size of qualitative research. But what we also found out when we did this was that we were actually getting additional insights around sort of formal education, how for unfair treatment at work can be understood by young people, what their views are on things like junior wages. and how accessible they actually find some of this government information. So we sort of garnered all these additional insights as we went along in this process of trying to build up the evidence base. And another thing that we wanted to do in our report was we wanted to almost look backwards a little bit to some of the earlier research on young people and workplace rights, particularly to the work of Paula MacDonald and colleagues. And Paula was on our national roundtable, which forms part of the evidence base of this report. And within that work, there was that greater focus on young people's subjective experiences. But there is also a greater focus on national employment standards, which is something that we'll maybe come and talk about a little bit further as we go. So we wanted to sort of update some of that work. So some of that work is now 20 years old. So essentially, what we're trying to do with this report was build up that evidence base so that we have that more full picture around young people's perceived knowledge gaps and reporting difficulties around workplace rights. So a little bit on the methodology, and I'm a bit of an academic nerd. So I come from a research background. I did my PhD in youth political engagement, and I can catch Nelly, my colleague, out of the corner of my eye laughing. So I think that for all of us, it's to be really imperative about being honest about what our findings show and some of the limitations to our findings. So one of the things that you might have noticed if you've looked through past AYAC reports is we kind of differentiate between surveys and insight polls. And we kind of do that. So a survey for us is something that's nationally representative, whereas a youth insight poll maybe uses more snowballing techniques to sort of grow that sample, and it isn't necessarily random or nationally representative. So our youth insight poll in this one has 250 responses recruited through Student Edge, and also 250 responses recruited through our own networks. So there is that element of snowball sampling that is within this research. And that does sort of color some of the findings. And I'll come and I'll speak to that in a little second. And one of the things that we did within the methodology was we have Youth Brains Trust members who were sort of sharing the survey with their friends. And to really give them a greater sense of involvement with our work, we decided to offer some of those that shared the survey the opportunity to participate in a research methods workshop and to provide some sort of provisional analysis of the findings that we have incorporated into the work. So I will come on, I'll speak a little bit about some of their insights as we work through the presentation. We also supplemented that Youth Insight poll with a youth consultation with 8 young people from all around Australia, different states and territories. And as I mentioned before, we also did a national roundtable on the topic that was inclusive of young people, practitioners, academics, and other people working in the youth policy space. So we have different sort of methods of evidence here that are incorporated into the report and into the findings. And I did just want to say, look, although the survey wasn't nationally representative, we did get a good sort of spread of young people from all around different states and territories. And it's actually not too dissimilar from what a nationally representative survey in terms of the distribution from each state and territory would look like. So we did get quite a broad coverage within the Youth Insight poll. We also got loads of different young people participating. We had quite a diverse sample. You know, we had young women, young men, gender diverse youth with young people living with disability, those from regional, rural, remote areas called young people, LGBTQI plus young people. So we had quite a broad spectrum of views represented in the Insight poll as well. So in terms of giving us some insights from which we can jump off with, it is actually reasonably valuable. So what I want to do now is I want to just share with you one of our sort of key findings from the Youth Insight poll. And I think this really sort of sets a good sort of basis and context for a lot of the findings that follow. So we asked young people whether they agreed, disagreed with the statement that more needs to be done to educate young people on their workplace rights. And the reason why we asked this question is we did a previous piece of research in youth rights-based youth engagement, sorry. And one of the big findings of that report, and indeed all of the sort of reports and advocacy and engagement that we've done with young people, is when we bring up this issue of rights, one of the most common themes that we have come across in all of that work is that young people do not feel like they're being given a substantial enough education about their rights. So when we ask this here question about, do you think that more needs to be done to educate young people on their workplace rights? We weren't incredibly surprised to see that almost 94% of young people felt that more needed to be done. And then when we went and we looked a little bit deeper, and we wanted to ask some sort of questions to try and gauge, well, what sort of specific rights or entitlements is it that young people feel like they need to know more about? So we wanted to gauge their sort of understanding around a sort of broad spectrum of different rights, from like minimum working ages to maximum hours they can work, the minimum age and calculating junior pay rates, things about casual loading, health and safety in the workplace, protection against bullying, etc. Rules around unfair dismissal. And I think what was quite interesting here is, even though, as I was saying before, some of that previous research from about 20 years ago that looked at similar things, what we see is that the findings from this are actually broadly consistent with that previous research from about 20 years ago, in that what we are finding here is that sort of broad protections, things around like health and safety, bullying, or when you can start working your minimum age, these things are actually reasonably well understood. However, when we get into those more sort of technical areas, particularly around sort of casual loading, and holiday pay and stuff like that, there, we sort of find that that confidence that young people have kind of disintegrates that little bit. So that knowledge sort of um, becomes less the more sort of technical that we get, which is what we would broadly expect. But I think what is actually quite interesting about these sets of findings here is we were actually quite shocked, personally, because we sort of thought, oh, there might be a bit of over-reporting, and we were quite sort of surprised, should I say, maybe not shocked, that actually none of these things got over 60%. And then we kind of sort of thought about it ourselves, and we were like, well, actually, if somebody asked us these questions out of the blue, what would be our honest answer? And it kind of made a little bit more sense. And when we talked to some of the young people about these findings, what was actually quite telling was that they weren't overly shocked by the findings, and they actually thought that some of them would be a little bit lower. And I remember sort of speaking to one of our young members at the survey workshop, and they were like, I was talking to my friends about this, and like we didn't even think about all of these different things before we actually got given the survey and were asked to think about them. And we come to explore maybe some of the narrative evidence later on. I think there is a bit of a picture that gets painted, that young people really sort of learn about these things as they go and as and when they become an issue. So I think we will start to paint a bit more of a picture around some of these findings as we go. But what I did think was quite revealing about the sets of findings is we gave quite a long list of different rights and entitlements there. And almost 1 in 5 said that they didn't really feel like they'd been educated well enough about any of them. So that is really showing some of the gaps here that we have around rights literacy that we need to be addressing through formal and informal forms of education. And I just wanted to sort of build up with some of the narrative evidence from the youth consultation, because um, what that conversation really showed was young people get that there is a minimum wage. They get that there's a minimum employment age. They get that they're not supposed to be bullied or harassed at work, and they get that they're supposed to get some holidays. But what we sort of found with that was when we start to open up that conversation around these things, it became a matter of confidence, really, because while they had that understanding that in theory there are supposed to be these broad protections, because they were unsure about the specifics of how those protections are to be realized, they start to really sort of talk about having a lack of confidence in their knowledge. I'll just share some of the quotes here. I'll read them out. I don't really know that much about wages and job specific rights. When it comes to wages and more job specific things, the only thing I'm familiar with is the wage difference between ages. So again, we have this sort of sense that we know there are rights there, but what do they actually mean specifically? What are those actual very sort of concrete protections? And we have another quote here, which is, I think that pay is probably the primary focus. Like, I don't think, in my experience, I've ever experienced a very significant health and safety precaution or what that would mean to them. And I think we've got another one here, which is wage theft is obviously very illegal, but I think that young people are going to struggle to read an employment contract and struggle to identify wage theft unless it's really obvious. And again, what we're saying is we know that there are these things that are wrong that can happen, but we need this technical knowledge and we need to understand, how do we identify this and what is our recourse? And I think what was quite interesting as that sort of conversation developed was that it really became a focal point that when young people actually enter the employment market or enter a particular job, they get confronted with a position description, a contract, or some sets of training. And what they actually find with these things is that they're actually very complicated. When they start out, this documentation that they get given doesn't really actually help them understand the technical specific things that they need to know in order to make their rights at the workplace a reality. And as that conversation deepened, there was this great deal of conversation around this need to get rid of legalese and this complicated language that makes everything so much harder to understand. And I think as well, when we had that sort of conversation and this developed and we were talking about, oh, we need to know these specifics and what would help you guys understand the specifics. The young people start to actually engage in quite solution orientated forms of thinking. And they were saying things like maybe just have some type of basic executive summary of what the contract means. And they do a really good job making it hard to read. And just having a document that people go, that's too much, I'll put it to the side. But what they wanted was just some accessible advice on what they're entitled to as they go on in an executive summary format, in some dot points, so that they know things about this is how many hours I'm supposed to be working. This is when I can be expected to work. This is how many breaks I get. This is my rate of pay. And this is how I can get my holidays. And if I'm entitled to casual loading, this is how this works. So they were thinking, how do we have that in some basic, easy, accessible way as we start off on our employment journeys? Because as I was saying before there, it's not that young people don't understand broad protections. It's these specifics and this technical knowledge that they really need that support with. And this sort of brings us to the second point. So, a big part of this research, and it will not surprise many people on the call, was we wanted to look at the literacy. Do we understand these things? But we have to understand that that isn't the only challenge to making workplace rights real. We also have to deal with this matter of power imbalances in the workplace and how young people are structurally disadvantaged in the workplace relative to employers. And I'll come on and I'll speak a little bit more about that in the coming slides. But first, I just want to set out some basic context from the insight poll that we did on what young people sort of thought about this more broadly. So we asked them the question, advocating for your rights in the workplace is usually easy for young people. We give them the options of agree, disagree, not sure, and not to answer. And 86% felt that it's usually challenging for young people to assert their rights. And then when we went a little bit further and we did the consultations and we did the roundtable evidence, we got a very clear narrative picture. And this is only one quote. There's quite a few different quotes in the report itself that helps build up this picture. But I think that it's a very good summary of a lot of the discussions that was had with young people as we started to unpick this. So this is a quote from a young person where they said, so I'll start with pay. I think it's pretty clear to see that pay isn't the only barrier. I feel like pay is something that's really visible, whereas the real issues are very much structural and not as obvious. But when we think about power imbalance for young workers, it's often worsened by casual or really insecure employment. Young people can be seen as easily replaceable. They don't have as much bargaining power when they're negotiating with employers who have control over things like shift, hours, and references. This means that as young people, we don't have the same level of power to actually challenge the structural inequalities in treatment that we're receiving within the workplace. So I think that was quite a clear sort of view of what that sort of power imbalance actually is and how it relates to the realities of that relationship. So it is these things like employers do have that control over shift hours, references, and if young people are to speak out, they're fearful of repercussions. But another quite interesting thing that came up in these discussions around power imbalances was that it wasn't actually just the control over things like shift hours and references, as important as they were. The young people also talked about an asymmetry or perceived asymmetry in knowledge. Whereas employers who have been employing young people have that greater experience of the workplace and greater knowledge around what the rules of the workplace are, whereas young people don't always have that as they're entering into their first sort of job. So it's not just this sort of control over the shifts, it's also that young people sometimes feel that there's this knowledge gap between them and employers in terms of experience, and that also needs to be addressed. And I think what a part of the reason why I think these things are quite important as well is when we actually got out and we spoke to young people, there were instances in the group of people experiencing inappropriate behaviors in the workplace, people experiencing workplace or wage theft and stuff like that, and having to go through these quite arduous reporting procedures and not really knowing what their sort of what the what the outcome of those sorts of things were going to be. So I thought that really sort of thrown into high relief this idea of not just the literacy element, but of this power imbalance as well, and the need to have that more holistic approach in terms of how we address these things. And I think what actually really came up here, and it was quite sort of an interesting chat that we had in the consultations, which is just how powerful a lens that money can be in terms of how young people perceive unfair treatment in the workplace and what they're sort of willing to put up with and how they relate their rights on the one hand to pay on the other. And I think that what I'll do is I'll just read out what the young people were saying so that gives you guys maybe a greater understanding of what it is that I'm trying to talk about. So I think a lot of the time when we maybe are having a bad night, we're in an unsafe environment, a non-supportive environment. Our instant mindset is, oh, if I just got paid a little bit more, it would make up for these things. But then I'll be having a quiet night where I'm relaxing, I'm having a good time, and all of a sudden my pay isn't that bad. So it's actually the conditions and the working environment that we're in, that's the key thing. And what I sort of found quite interesting about that was that the idea of this being an unsafe environment or non-supportive environment, it wasn't that these are violations of my rights. These are things that I should be paid more for. And I think that if we really want to sort of make these things real, that young people don't necessarily feel like they're being paid to put up with bad behavior or that their rights are contingent on the level of pay that they're receiving. I think this is something that we really, really have to take seriously. And one of the young people like sort of riffing on this point and developing on it was like, I think the reason why we go to pay quite instantly is because it's a number. You can quantify it. Like a dollar in my hand is worth the same as a dollar in your hand. But something like harassment, even though there's a very precise legal definition, it can be more vague. It's not as easily to define, you know. Like pay can become a proxy for things that are harder to name. It's legible. If my manager makes me feel uneasy in a job, my brain can convert it into I should be paid more. which means when young people are saying it's about money, the thing they might be trying to say is, I don't like my conditions at work. Do you know what I mean? And I think that's a really sort of powerful thing for us when because so often when we deal in terms of rights or the language of rights or workplace rights or youth rights and participation and all these sorts of things, they can become sort of quite abstract. And if we're entering into conversations with young people where we're sort of thinking about how are they understanding their rights in the workplace, I think it's very important for us as practitioners who work with young people to understand that if young people are talking about not being paid enough, or if they're talking about I don't get paid enough for the work that I do, or I should be paid more for this, this mightn't just be a case of pay. This might actually reflect working conditions that transgress or violate their rights. And that's something that I think that we need to be quite aware of, especially if we're trying to sort of build up that sort of literacy around rights, but also making those rights actually quite concrete in practice. So basically what I'm trying to say there is if we're having a conversation with young people around these things, we need to be always aware that pay might be that proxy for some of these sort of harmful conditions that we're really sort of hoping to address through the furtherance of actual compliance with workplace rights. Um, Another thing which I actually thought was quite interesting as well, and this was a little insight that we had in the consultations, and I'm basically just treating you guys to all of my favorite little insight things that they said, because like as most people here on this call probably realize, young people often come out with things that you weren't really expecting. And a part of our advocacy at AYAC has been consistently looking at reviewing junior rates of pay. And what was actually quite interesting was the almost the ambivalence with which young people sort of approach that issue, because it wasn't all one way or the other. There's quite a little bit of nuance in their discussion around that. And I'll just read out the quote from one of the participants. I think realistically, pace needs to be less for younger workers. If we want to get young people into the workplace, it has to be a bit less. There'd be no reason why a business would employ someone with 40 years experience and someone with no experience. But I definitely think that the bottom line, the national minimum wage for anyone under 18 definitely needs to be reviewed because a lot of people already have experience. I'm 17 now. Next year, I'll get a 40% increase in pay. I'm a bit confused as to what will be different in 12 months' time as to why I'm 40% worth 40% more. And I think, again, it's this nuance around these sort of things when we're talking about, working with young people and amplifying their voice. It's this sort of nuance that I think that we really need to bring to the fore into these discussions. Like young people, they can recognize that in order to get that experience, there might need to be some tapering of pay. But I think what's really interesting here is when we open up that conversation to a bit more dialogue, what we're actually seeing is this there's actually a wider problem here around what the minimum wage is for young people in general. But also at what point should young people receive these increases in pay? Should it be tied to their on-the-job experience? So essentially, when we start to actually engage young people in these conversations, we actually open up a much more nuanced policy discussion than maybe more simplistic, let's abolish all junior rates of pay now, or let's keep them all, there's no problem. So it really does invite a much more considered policy debate when we actually open up these discussions around workplace rights to young people. And another sort of thing that when we were doing this, we wanted to look at where are they getting their information from? Interestingly, family and schools are amongst the most popular places. Also, a lot of people are getting advice from friends. They're getting taught on the job at work. Trade unions was a bit further down, and I'll come on and I'll speak about trade unions as well because there were some interesting findings there that aren't necessarily reflected in the rest of the presentation. Fair Work Ombudsman was quite popular as well, and we've got some um, findings in that too. there was Digital Youth Hub, and it was quite interesting actually. I think it's like 7% said the Digital Youth Hub. And when we did the survey workshop with one of the young people, they were like, do you think that might be because of AIAC's connection with the Office for Youth that that's quite as high? Might that be a little bit of sampling bias? And ultimately, yes, it might well be. But we'll come on, we'll speak to some of these sort of sources of information a little bit more detailed. But I'll just maybe focus in on this point of trade unions, which was one of the lower sources of information for workplace rights sought by young people in our insight poll. Because when we did the consultation with the young people, they actually didn't mention trade unions at all until we got to the very end. And I said to them, like, well, why haven't we mentioned trade unions? Um, and one of the young people actually said, I actually can't believe that we haven't mentioned trade unions because that's like almost trying to talk about putting out a fire without discussing the fire brigade. And we actually had quite an interesting sort of discussion around that. And some young people raised this idea that because we're young, we don't really think that trade unions are for us. They also raised this idea around your employers might necessarily want you to join trade unions. There might be a bit of like you might be looked on with suspicion if you join a trade union. But that was quite an interesting thing in terms of like a debate where we would think that the trade unions might center an awful lot more in. There was there was actually much more sort of they were much more peripheral in terms of importance to young people, not just in the survey but also in the consultation. But when they were raised as a potential sort of body to support the realization of workplace rights, we actually got quite an interesting sort of conversation around that. So that was something I found quite interesting in the report. And as I said before, we had that original finding there around, there's not enough education. And I think that kind of reflects a sense that even though we have all these different sources of information, people are picking up bits from their family and they're picking up bits from friends and bits here at work. There is really that sense among the young people that actually we're just learning as we go. As something comes up that I need help with, that's when I get the help, that's when I get the support. And I'll just read out some of the quotes to that effect. All of my understanding has come from personal experiences, not formal education. I would say there's near nothing done to explain to young people their rights before they start work. School-wise, I think if you choose certain electives like commerce, business, you might have a basic understanding. But I know in my state anyway, our syllabus doesn't go into it that much. They overemphasize that you will have an agreement or a contract, and that will be your rights, but it doesn't really tell you how to interpret those. So we have again this idea of like, where is it that we might be getting these different sources of information, but where is this sort of structured youth workplace rights literacy education piece coming from? And I think when we come on, we talk a little bit about AIAC's policy recommendations. We'll revisit some of these points, but I just wanted to sort of flag them up preemptively before we get there. Um, but what I also want to talk about in terms of this idea of sources of information, what was the most trusted source of information? And when we did the consultation, it was actually a very clear winner, which was government. And we get things like, personally, I would go for like a government source, the Fair Work Commission, those kinds of sources, because that's what I think I would trust. And there's this idea, if it's something that an employer would trust, like a government document, I would trust it too. And I think we got that. To be honest, if it has the Australian government logo on it, I'd believe it. Because I would trust what the employers are going off as well. So I suppose in some ways, in terms of rights literacy, it does seem like there are actually some very trusted sources of information that young people will look upon and believe. But I think another big part of this work was we want to how actually effective and accessible are these resources. So if we have, as it appears to be, this gap in formal education around workplace rights, and young people are, as our evidence seems to be indicating, have to learn in the go. How accessible are these resources through which that they might do that? And to gauge their perspectives on that, we took them through a guided tour of the Australian Government's Digital Youth Hub and the Workplace Rights section, which then links to the Fair Work Ombudsman resources. And this was some of the initial feedback that we got on those government resources. I'm already overwhelmed. I would have clicked out already. I'm done. Yeah, I'm on ChatGPT now. There's way too much text. There could be a much easier to read summaries, more in-depth descriptions to click on, but I see no reason why I need to click more than 3 times to find such simple information. If I just want a simple answer, I should be able to get that in less than 5 clicks. So, although I'm not going to treat you guys to a similar guided tour of the workplace rights resources, essentially what it is, it's a platform where you click, then it takes you onto the Fair Work Ombudsman's website, and there's a load and load of text, right? And the reason why I sort of want to center in on this now is one of the things that I said at the outset of this talk was Australia's workplace rights framework is incredibly complex. As someone from the UK who embarked upon this research, I was actually surprised by just how complex it was. And part of the reason why we integrated this guided tour of these resources in was we actually found it quite difficult to work out what was going wrong. I have a PhD. My colleague has a degree. We're quite old and experienced in the workplace. We find these things quite difficult to navigate. So when we're talking about this thing around systems complexity, there is not just a need to revamp these resources, which the young people give us some good insights into how we might do that, which I'll speak about a little bit more. But there is this need to start to grapple with some of this systems complexity too. And that is something that we do deal with within the recommendations of the report. And I will come on and speak to that not too distant future. But oh, I left the bullet point in. But before I do that, I just wanted to provide again some of that evidence from the young people around, what would actually make these sorts of resources better. Because, again, when we work with young people, we always say, their participation actually makes these things stronger. And again, when we involve them in these things, we actually see that there is nuanced interest and ideas around solutions that we can actually advocate for and try and sort of push through with our policy and advocacy work. So they give this sort of quite candid feedback, which is, I like the front page. It looks amazing. But the fact that it takes you to another government website, which looks so dull, and you have to look for all the information yourself, is so hard. If the information was summarized on that page, the previous website, but they give you a link for reference, like this is where we source the information from, it would make it a lot easier. So essentially, what we are asking young people to do at the minute, acknowledging that they're often learning on the job, is we're sending them to these websites that are very, very dense in information, not an awful lot of it summarized, and they're having to do an awful lot of sifting through, which is very, very challenging, which hence where the chat GPT comment I think came from before. And I think here's, and again, we've got young people who work with young people on the call here today. And this will come as a surprise to nobody. I think that it could be a lot more interactive, like have the facts, the absolute basic stuff, but then like offer us a quiz or like a selection of options so that we can get our more specific information. And what was meant by that was if I enter in my age, dates, and what I'm looking for, if I click those things, I should be able to get specific information to me. Not so much like a quiz, but like a almost like a multiple choice sort of thing where it generates information. And then again, it was quite surprising actually that in terms of all of this sort of resources out there, there isn't really very much video explainers, anything like that, no reels. So trying to actually open it up to that interactive content that young people are going to be engaging with or are more likely to engage with would actually make these things a lot more easy to and accessible. So really that is my what is it, 30 odd page report in about how many minutes? About 20 minutes, half an hour. Hopefully, I didn't bore you to tears, and hopefully, it wasn't too rambling because I kind of find when I do things like this, I get hyper focused on the things that I find really interesting. And it doesn't always follow like a natural, logical progression. But hopefully, some of those findings were quite interesting. I would be surprised if they were very, very surprising to anybody else. Other than the fact that certain of the what rights didn't go over 60%, we weren't too surprised by too much of it. But moving on now to consider the recommendations and the policy angle from that sort of analysis that we've just done. Um, so this is actually our first recommendation is in line with UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which suggests or states that there should be minimum ages of employment legislated across the state or across the nation. Anybody who's tried to look into this will have their mind boggled to know actually what the minimum age is in particular states. States like Victoria have it at 15, and then there's exemptions. But then in other states, there's exemptions around working in family businesses. And it's a very complex hodgepodge. And also, when you add on to this, there's also different regional variations in terms of if you're still at school, how many hours that you can work. And I remember just sort of looking at that and thinking, as a young person, that I would personally find that very, very confusing. And again, one of the young people that we had in the consultation was I didn't actually know what age I was allowed to start working. I just started working because my friends were, and I thought that I was able to. So there is like a really sort of complex system there. It's not very difficult. It's not very easy to know, when you're allowed to work, how many hours you're allowed to work, and even if you're working within, say, you're working while you're at school within certain family businesses or you're working so many hours and keeping things, there's still grey areas there around how that those rights are actually applicable, given how sort of complex they actually are. And our sort of thing is here is this comes from 20 years ago. So in an article literally in 2005, Paul McDowell from Queensland University said to make our workplace rights framework more compliant with the CRC, what we should be doing is having a national minimum employment age. Um, and we also need to work to harmonise maximum working hours for school-aged young people. So when we were talking there before about young people going onto these websites trying to find out this information, our sort of thing would be they would be like nationally, you're allowed to work at this age. Might be a Victorian thing where if you get an exemption, you can work this, but that has to be applied for. But nationally, that's the standard. Nationally, if you're at school, this is how many hours you can work while you're at school. And for myself, it's always been something that I find quite puzzling, which is what's the difference between a young person in Victoria and a young person in Northern Territory and a young person in Western Australia on these issues? Why should it be okay for a young person to work at a very young age in one place and not another? So we would like to see those national employment standards around minimum employment ages and harmonising maximum working age for school age young people because it just reduces that complexity, makes the system more easier and fair. We also, this is a youth law policy submission to the recent national employment standards. Um, and it's actually reflective of what the young people were asking for in our consultation. So we're fully in support of it. We want to work to mandate an accessible statement of terms and working conditions. So employment contracts, very complex legalese. And what we want to see is a simple, accessible statement that tells young people what their conditions and their rights are in the workplace at the front of all contracts. They know what their breaks are. They know how many hours they're allowed to work. They have you are free from bullying. Bullying is X, Y, Z, health and safety. Da, 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 da. We want that very simple, accessible statement in easy English at the start of every employment for young people so that they actually have some of that technical knowledge that they feel like they need more support with. Oh. I've done two recommendations back to back. We also believe that if we're going to advocacy effectively, we have to actually look at what the government's doing well. And the government actually has done quite a lot through the Fair Work Ombudsman recently to enforce wage theft. So I think recent efforts have recovered hundreds of millions of dollars of unpaid wages, demonstrating the importance of strong compliance measures. However, from a recent I think it's report evaluation by the Fair Work Ombudsman. They also look at where the industries that need where persistent underpayments is still going on. Are industries, like services, service industries, cafes, restaurants, stuff like that there, where young people are actually more likely to work or more likely to be starting out in the career. So there is this need to keep this sort of effort going to make sure that young workers are protected. Um, we also want to look at the further reform of junior pay rates. So we welcome the recent changes to those sectors to ensure that 18-year-olds receive fair pay with, what is it, 3 months more experience. But our sort of thing here around exploring this further actually comes from some evidence collected by the West Justice Reports, which actually shows that if we were to abolish junior pay rates for those above 18, it would have a modest impact and employers couldn't grow effective demand in the economy. So there is, but as I said before, there is a lot of nuance and a lot of different perspectives with young people around that issue. So I think the reason why we sort of focused in on this language around exploring this is because we think that actually there is a little bit more of a need for consultation with young people around it as well, looking at these things, marshalling the evidence, involving them in that decision. But I think that is something that would definitely make that sort of system of workplace rights a little bit more simple if after 18 everyone got paid a basic minimum wage. Um, Another thing, and this will be no big surprise given what I've told you, is we believe that there can be so much more done to actually make the government resources interactive, easy to navigate, youth friendly, bring in the video explainers, make it actually easy to understand. If we are acknowledging that there are these problems within formal education, which will be one of the next recommendations, let's make how young people can learn as and when or on the job as easy as possible. They trust these sources. It doesn't seem to be a matter of trust. It seems to be a matter of accessibility and translation, how we translate the rights into easy to understand language. And of course, this is probably one of the AYAC favorites for recommendations. Revise civics and citizenship education to improve understanding of workplace rights. And when we did, we actually had some more evidence in the report, and it's in there. You can have a look at it, and when you get the report. Young people talked about the need to actually link these things to real life experience. They talk about scenario learning. They talk about making it interactive. They talk about making it relevant to their school situation. Like if a headmaster does this, a teacher does, like trying to actually link it to their everyday experiences so that they can actually retain some of that information. And part of that, our ongoing and our submissions to government previously in civics has been looking at different forms of teacher training. But another part of it as well is, and I think I'll talk about this a little bit at the end, is bringing in some of those insights from youth work, from informal learning, because um, that type of scenario-based learning, that type of interactive learning, learning through games, learning through discussion is something that youth workers do very well. But I'll talk about that in a little bit in a second, maybe. Um, and another one that we want to talk about as well is like one of the big sort of things that I've been trying to get across here, and is this idea that when we talk to young people, when we actually ask them, we get these nuances, we get this understanding that there's grey areas, and we get this genuine interest in actually trying to be solution focused and working through the different problems. And if we are to sort of really advance workplace rights, I think that we do need to do more to make sure that young people are involved. in the policy making around those rights or those things that are go into governing how people behave in the workplace. So to do that more effectively, we've talked about rights-based youth impact assessments. So that means that basically everything that the government does, if it affects young people, they have to at least engage in some form of consultation process and ensure that young people's voices are embedded in decision making. And finally, and this is a bit of a, I suppose, a self plug, not just for AYAC, but for probably a lot of organizations in the call. Engage youth sector expertise in the delivery of that youth engagement work. Meaningful youth engagement, it requires more than this consultation. It requires more than these tokenistic practices. The youth sector actually has the engagement techniques, the approach to practice that can help ensure that young people's voices genuinely shape decisions, but also that they feel respected and treated with dignity throughout that. And I think as well, in terms of what I'm trying to say here. There's also this thing around youth work as well as being a bit of non-formal education. You know, there's a opportunity for us here in the youth sector as non-formal educators to make this a part of our work, to try and find accessible ways to teach young people about their rights, what these things mean in practice. And that can be just that thing of bringing in that scenario-based learning, doing some different form of engagement with young people. Um, so that's really where we landed on with a lot of the recommendations, a lot of the findings, and hopefully they come together into quite a coherent sort of approach to the issue. We identify the gaps in literacy. We look at ways that we can strengthen that. We look at power imbalances. We look at how we can crack down on wage theft and things like that there. We talk about, young people actually making meaningful contributions, and we set out ways that we can involve them more fulsomely in that discussion. And just before I open up to Q&As, I'll just do the last sort of key takeaway. So the summary of the report is improving workplace rights for young people is not simply about increasing awareness of entitlements. It's about ensuring that young people are recognized as legitimate rights holders and supported through systems, workplaces, and policies that enable those rights to be meaningfully understood, exercised, and upheld in practice.